Okay, so it's 10. I think we should start. Hello, everyone. Marhaba. Welcome to everyone watching us. Thanks for taking the time out of your weekend today to tune into our live. My name is Mira Nabulsi. I'm a researcher and an audio producer, and I'm a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. With me today are Dr. Nada Aliya, Dr. Hana Al-Masri, and Yazan Zaza. I think we should. Sorry, there was an echo, so I'm just going to go ahead and repeat the intro because I think there was a little bit echo from my browser. So I was saying that today with me is Dr. Nada Aliya, Hana Al-Masri, and Yazan Zaza. I will let them each introduce themselves before we dive in and talk more about our collective and our work. Would you mind starting, Nada? You're muted, I think, Nada.
Of course, I'm muted, right? This is the very nature of Zoom events. You're muted. All right. So my name is Nada Aliya. I'm a diaspora Palestinian. I'm a writer, a scholar, a long-term feminist. I would say I probably was a feminist before I was even aware of the term feminist. I'm an organizer. I served on the steering collective of Insight, Women and Trans People of Color Against Violence. I served on the collective of AUSA, the Arab Women's Solidarity Association, and now I am a very proud member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. That's enough. And I'm a writer and a teacher.
Hannah, do you want to go?
Sure. Hi, I'm Hana Masri. I am also a writer and a teacher, and I am a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement. I organize with the Palestinian Youth Movement. I also am proud to organize with the newly created Palestinian Feminist Collective.
Cool.
Yazan, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Nada and Hannah are so humble. My name is Yazan, and I am a community organizer, and I also work as a researcher. So I organize with the Palestinian Youth Movement in Southern California, and I work as the community organizer for an organization called Vigilant Love, which does a lot of work looking at the structural and communal impacts of Islamophobia and the war on terror, especially with regards to surveillance. And yeah, I spend most of my other work doing research on the relationship between war, migration, and surveillance. Also very excited to be part of the PFC and here today.
Thank you all. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the purpose of today's live. I think the main idea was to kind of just put some faces behind this name, the Palestinian Feminist Collective. We wanted to talk a little bit about who we are. Today, our collective has about 80 members. And so we will talk about how we came together. We also want to talk about our first public initiative, which is the pledge that many of our Facebook community may have read already and signed. And finally, I wanted to address, or I wanted us to address a few of the comments and questions that we received from our community around the pledge. And if time permits and we see some questions from our Facebook community here, then maybe we'll try our best to answer some of those as well. So to start with, just to start with, what is the Palestinian Feminist Collective? I don't know if you want to take this one, Yazan.
Sure. So the Palestinian Feminist Collective is a collective of academics, organizers, and other professionals who identify as Arab or Palestinian feminists. We originally started from an initiative that came from the 2020 International Women's Day statement released by the Palestinian Youth Movement. But since then, we went through the process of becoming a working group that was developing ideas for looking at how we as Palestinian feminists in the US could tackle anti-repression work against liberal Zionism, and also work on developing collective healing for community within the Palestinian and Arab communities in the US and abroad. So from the working group process, we started developing more concrete ideas and proposals for work that we have since been able to launch. And at that time is when we started transitioning into the Palestinian Feminist Collective that's more formally seen today. I don't know if Hannah, you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think that essentially covers our history. I think the only thing I would add is also just kind of our focus on trying to hold together social and political liberation, and that's something that I'm sure we will get more into in this discussion.
So let's hone in maybe on our pledge, our first public initiative, the pledge that Palestine is a feminist issue. This is a public pledge and a commitment that we put out on March 15th, where we worked with ally organizations to sign and help publicize and share all over this pledge. The aim of this pledge and commitment that Palestine is a feminist issue was aimed at just broadly ally organizations and just people, just as loving people and individuals, as well as organizations, but also US women and feminist organizations that have long ignored or kind of collaborated really in mainstreaming of Zionist thought in the US. I wanted Neda to talk to us a little bit more about where this idea came from and why is it important.
Unmute. Okay, so sure, Mira, as you pointed out, feminism has long been excluded from most progressive, from a lot of progressive spaces that have mainstreamed Zionism. Most activists, most allies in the struggle for justice in Palestine and for the Palestinian people are familiar with the expression PEP, progressive except for Palestine. And one manifestation of PEP is FEP, feminist except for Palestine. And we've encountered this feminism except for Palestine in our organizing for decades. I mean, as far back as I remember as a young feminist organizer, I would constantly encounter this. And so the pledge is in some ways a reaction, a response to the feminism except for Palestine. I think every Palestinian woman, every Arab or Muslim woman in the US has experienced some manifestation of FEP, feminism except for Palestine, where all the wonderful analysis of feminism as a liberating ideology suddenly collapses when our circumstances are discussed because we are primarily oppressed by Zionism. So the basic concept in feminism that the personal is political and the political is personal suddenly disappears when it comes to analyzing Palestinian women's circumstances because we are not even allowed to name our oppressor as Zionism. And it's gone on for decades, and it's gone on multiple levels, from the Women's March to publishing personal essays, publishing articles, publishing scholarship, to teaching, to mainstream, even anti-racist alliance and coalition work. And it's happened in so many different spaces. One tends to think primarily of the space of mainstream white feminism, but it's also happened in spaces where we thought we had allies. And so I'm going to share a couple of experiences, and I have I put this book alongside me to remind me to share this experience. So this is the book, This Bridge We Call Home. And for me, this is a very good manifestation of the kind of feminism except for Palestine that Palestinian feminists and our allies have encountered over the years. So this book was published in 2002. Basically, it was envisioned as the 20-year anniversary of that absolutely groundbreaking anthology, This Bridge called Our Back, which is, as I said, the absolutely groundbreaking anthology by radical feminists of color in the US. And 20 years later, there was this desire by some publishers and editors to come up with a 20-year anniversary edition. And that's this Bridge We Call Home. And in this Bridge We Call Home was the first time that Arab American feminists were in conversation with other feminists of color and not of color in the US in a major publication. And so the editors had started an email conversation among all of the contributors to this anthology. And in the email conversation prior to the publication of the book, there was so much attack and hatred towards the Arab American feminist contributors. There are 8 of us Arab American feminist contributors, and the kind of absolutely toxic environment that happened because we were speaking out against Zionism, because we were critical of Israel, is an idea, gives you one idea of the many, many, many spaces where Arab American feminism, Palestinian feminism was shut down with hatred in supposedly feminist spaces, right? And so the pledge addresses that kind of experience that we've had where we are shut out of feminist places. This unfortunately happened in a place that was supposedly progressive and radical, but it happens throughout. And that's one example. And, let me know if I have time to discuss more examples, but I can.
Yeah, please go ahead. I was actually also, in addition to more examples, I was just curious maybe to let people know, since you have, all of these experiences working as an activist, as a scholar, have things changed really throughout all of these years that you've been active? Have you seen a shift slightly when it comes to Palestine and kind of the level of acknowledgement or comfort when it comes to showing solidarity, even in I don't know, obviously there are so many different types of women and feminist organizations in the US. But if you can tell us a little bit about if you've seen a shift and have things improved more recently.
I think there has been a shift in communities of color, progressive communities of color, where there's an acknowledgement of Zionism being an oppressor, but even within those spaces, there's still a need for a lot of education. So we have allies, we have a growing number of allies, and we've always had allies. I mean, I don't want to say that this is a recent development. Way back, there's been a lot of Black Palestinian solidarity before the Black Lives Matter movement. I absolutely want to credit Black Lives Matter for for the solidarity, but we're looking at the 60s, and there was already in the 60s the civil rights movement, the Black liberation, the transnational, trans-African liberation. There's always been a history of solidarity that I do not want to dismiss. But there's also, that was very much the marginalized, the communist, the scary outsiders. And now we do see within the US itself a growing understanding of Zionism as an oppressive system. But alongside that growing understanding is, if you want, maybe even a more growing resistance to that amongst mainstream feminism, so that we are actually forcefully excluded, whereas we used to be excluded by default. So maybe that's how I would explain it. Like, I mean, right now, the Zionist movement, having grasped the fact that there's a growing understanding of Zionism being oppressive as well on both the political level, the macro political, as well as the feminist. Because of that understanding on the part of our Zionist foes, if you want, there's also a more intentional resistance to Palestine being understood as a feminist issue. And with that intentional understanding of Palestine as a feminist issue comes the constant reminder of the fact that, oh, well, there's Arab patriarchy and there's Arab conservatism and all of that. So it's a complex shift. I want to acknowledge that there's growing recognition of Zionism being sexually oppressive, a form of gender-based violence. But with that understanding, we're seeing the resistance being one by default, because there is such a thing as default feminism, default Zionism, to one being an active Zionism.
Mm-hmm. And if you bring us back now to the pledge, how do you feel like the pledge probably maybe tries to encompass some of those issues and maybe misunderstandings around Palestine and around how Zionism utilizes gender-based violence? What can you say additionally on the pledge?
I mean, I think the pledge does a very, very good job of actually explaining the manifestations of gendered violence that Zionism, how Zionism impacts Palestinian women and Palestinian communities in a gendered manner, because one tends to think of politics as if they were somehow free of any gendered dynamics, of any sexual dynamics. And it's like, no, I mean, obviously any oppressive system has multiple manifestations, and many of those manifestations are gendered based. And so the pledge actually explains that there's sexualized violence, there's gender based violence. I mean, I could go into the details of how Zionism is sexually oppressive and has gendered violence. You know, like, for example, when we speak of the fact that feminism, mainstream white feminism, Zionist feminism, wants to remind us all the time of how our culture being conservative is our main inhibitor. It's like, you know, what if I were to suddenly say, okay, there is no such thing as Arab Islamic patriarchy and a conservative value? Would I have freedom of movement as a Palestinian woman? After all, it is the Israelis, not the Palestinian men at the checkpoints, right? Would I, as a diaspora Palestinian woman whose parents were kicked out, had to leave Jerusalem in 1948, would I be allowed back into my homeland? It is not a Palestinian man. It is Zionism that is preventing me from returning home. It is Zionism that denies me access to healthcare. It is Zionism that denies me safety within my own home, right? So we need to understand that. And I think the pledge explains that Zionism has gendered aspects to oppression, aspects that mainstream feminism would love to forget. Mm-hmm. Because it complicates matters in a way that the mainstream feminism does not want them complicated, by bringing in the political aspect of oppression.
Mm-hmm. And to eliminate that more, maybe if someone can just go over the demands, we do have 6 very concrete demands included as part of the pledge and the commitment that we are asking organizations to sign on to. Can somebody maybe just go over those really fast?
Yeah, I can go over our demands. So, and also they can be found in the link to the pledge, which I think someone posted on Facebook. So also please sign if you haven't gotten a chance yet. So our demands are: first, embrace and advocate for Palestinian liberation as a critical feminist issue. Second, support Palestinian rights to free speech and political organizing everywhere. Third, reject the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, in particular the legal enforcement of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. Fourth, heed the call of Palestinian civil society for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Fifth, divest from militarism and invest in justice and community needs on Turtle Island, or what we know as the Americas. Sixth, call for an end to U.S. political, military, and economic support to Israel and to all military, security, and policing collaborations. So we can kind of see in these demands a lot of what Neda was talking about in terms of understanding the Palestinian Feminist Collective, our work as broader than the kind of narrow definition of feminism, that we're also trying to hold to account feminisms that don't have this larger anti-colonial, anti-imperial perspective on Zionism. And you can see that manifest in the demands, I think.
Thank you, Hannah. So I wanted to go over some of the latest data we have on the pledge, the countries that signed, or some of the organizations from different countries that signed. And as well some maybe public figures that endorsed our pledge. As of now, our pledge has over 3,500 signatures, including those of 200 organizations. We have received signatures from the US, Australia, Kenya, South Africa, Chile, and different other countries. Organizational endorsements include ones from the National Women's Studies Association, the Arab American Studies Association, the Democratic Socialists of America, Black Women Radicals, Global Grassroots Justice Alliance, and Jewish Voice for Peace. We have also received endorsements from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish faith-based organizations. And some of the Palestinian organizations that joined us in this as well include Talat in Palestine, the AMP, or the American Muslims for Palestine, USPCN, or the US Palestinian Community Network, Al-Auda, and the Free Democratic Palestine Movement. Some Palestinian women groups also endorsed. That includes the Palestinian American Women's Association of Southern California, the National Association of Arab American Women, and the American Palestinian Women's Association of Virginia. Students and youth groups include SJP and PYM, different local chapters as well as national. And some notable feminists that have endorsed as well include the Black abolitionist feminist Miriam Kaba, Chicana feminist Cherry Moraga, and Third World feminist Chandra Mohanty, and as well the renowned scholar and feminist Judith Butler. So this is a sample of some of the people and organizations that signed. We are very, very thankful and grateful for all the support that we have received so far on this pledge. Thank you all for this. And thank you for your commitment to Palestine, the Palestinian people, and justice for all our communities. And we hope that we will be having more opportunities in the near future to work with all of these organizations on more projects. So if there's nothing else on the pledge from you guys, the panelists, I'm gonna just move to talk a little bit about some of the comments that we have received when we publicized the pledge, if you guys are good with that. Okay, so different comments. I think I'm just gonna ask our panelists to kind of explain a little bit more about some of the most common questions and concerns that were raised, especially over different social media channels that publicized the pledge. The first comment that I saw being repeated a lot is, what does it even mean when we say Palestine is a feminist issue? And I saw different people say Palestine is, it's not a feminist issue, it's a human rights issue. So who wants to maybe kind of hone in on that and tell us a little bit more and explain, what does it even mean when we say Palestine is a feminist issue?
Yeah, I can jump in on that question. I also saw those comments and I found them really interesting because we mean a few different things when we talk about Palestine as a feminist issue. So on the one hand, and we've kind of started talking about all of these, but I'll go a little bit more into them. On the one hand, we're talking about issues of gender justice internal to Palestinian society, and especially the narrative that you get in a lot of kind of like liberation movements, that national liberation comes prior to questions of societal injustices, issues of social liberation. And so we're kind of asserting that social liberation and other forms of liberation of the collective go hand in hand, that you actually cannot have, for instance, injustices against women or gender-based violence and still claim to be achieving liberation. At the same time, it was crucial to us to articulate that the gendered violences that Palestinian women experience and gender nonconforming people experience is not just an internal matter to society. It was crucial to us to articulate that to Zionist settler colonialism itself as a form of gendered violence. So that was something that we really wanted to emphasize, that if Zionism affects people in specifically gendered ways, which we elaborate in our pledge, which we elaborate in the Women's Day statement that kind of sparked our collective, then we also need a robust opposition to settler colonialism within our feminism. And that kind of brings me to to the other major way that we're defining Palestine as a feminist issue is to say that we also are trying to assert, as we've kind of been saying already in this conversation, assert that you can't have feminism without Palestinian liberation either. So especially the feminist movements in the US, which is where we're located, so recognition of our position here, that our movements for feminism, for gender justice, cannot exclude Palestinian liberation either. So those are some of the different ways that we have been defining it.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think as well, like people frame the Palestinian issue in so many different ways. Just because we say Palestine is a feminist issue doesn't mean that we cannot also say that there are human rights violations, or that we're not recognizing it, or even framings like that it's a national liberation, or that it's a settler, a struggle against settler colonialism. So just one doesn't cancel other framings, but it is a way for us, like you were saying, Hannah, to acknowledge as well the very gendered aspects of this oppression and of the Zionist state.
Yeah, I think that's, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's a crucial point of understanding, that we're saying Palestine is a feminist issue, not Palestine is only a feminist issue.
Exactly, exactly. And very relevant to that, another question that I saw pop up a lot is why focus on women when occupation affects all Palestinians, not just women? Who wants to jump on that one?
I guess I could, because I actually wanted to add to what Hannah just said about, it's a very, very exclusionary definition and understanding of feminism when we say it is, how is it a feminist issue? But because feminism, I mean, it's very exclusionary to think that feminism is only about breaking the glass ceiling. Equal opportunity to become an oppressor, equal opportunity to become a million. I mean, that's a very narrow definition of feminism. And I think it's only when you have that very narrow definition of feminism, of individual advancement for women so that they become like men, in that sense, if you want, I wouldn't even want to consider Palestine as a feminist issue, because that's not the exclusionary understanding of feminism that I have. Feminism is collective liberation. I mean, you cannot, I'm thinking of third world feminism, I'm thinking of women of color feminism, I'm thinking of the grassroots radical feminism that has always understood that you cannot have a liberated society without every member of that society being liberated. And that also is one definition of feminism. Feminism as in like all of us, rather than those few women who only have one barrier, the glass ceiling. So I wanted to add that about like, what do we mean by Palestine is a feminist issue? In that collective liberation is also one of the main tenets of my kind of feminism, rather than white mainstream feminism. But the other question that you just brought up, Mira, about how the occupation affects all Palestinians, so why are we focusing on women, right? Oh, look, I am unmuted. I haven't just spoken to an empty screen. Sorry. So, of course, the occupation affects all Palestinians, but like all oppressive systems, the occupation being an oppressive system also has a gendered aspect, and we need to understand that gendered aspect. It's not sufficiently discussed, and it has to be discussed. And like all oppression, there's a macro level and a micro level, and we need to discuss the macro level of sexualized violence that happens as part of Israeli and Zionism from the very beginning. I mean, we're thinking, it's not a recent thing. I guess I'm here to bring back the historical context. Even back in the days of the massacre of Deir Yassin, for example, in the massacre of Deir Yassin, we speak of, the killing of the villagers. What we need to also know is that the women were being raped too. There's a very long and uninterrupted thread of sexual violence, like that is physical sexual violence, that is sexual violence, the threats of rape, the threats of sexual harassment, the women giving birth at the checkpoints, the women being having greater rates of malnutrition because we tend to sacrifice ourselves and we need more of one thing or the other. So when we look at the very long history of sexual violence, as well as women's resistance, it is not something recent. It is from the very beginning of Zionism. Zionism has viewed the Palestinians as a demographic threat. Zionism has engaged in rape. Zionism has engaged in ways to actually control our reproductive health, our reproductive rights, and therefore it's a reproductive justice issue. Also, Zionism has actually celebrated the fact that the birth rate among Palestinian women has declined as a result of the occupation of the West Bank. Zionism celebrates that. We have a long string of Israeli leaders who advocate rape, who view rape as a Zionist weapon. This is the kind of gendered violence that we need to be speaking about also when we say, yes, Zionism, occupation, settler colonialism impacts all Palestinians. But as we look at the impact on all Palestinians, it is very important to also look at the impact on Palestinian women, on Palestinian queers, and the fact that Zionism, even though it claims to be more civilized, more advanced, more whatever. I don't know what it claims to be, but it is violent, and it does address violence. It impacts violence. It engages in violence. It enacts violence in a very sexualized manner. And I also don't want to only speak about women, but also queers. I mean, Israel, which pretends to be a gay haven, right? A gay friendly country. Well, when Israel is bombing Gaza, Israel does not say, well, I'm going to spare this household because it has a young gay man in it and I'm a gay friendly country, therefore I will spare the gays, right? I mean, what kind of exclusion are we talking about when we don't address the gendered violence of Israel and the fact that Israel not only engages in direct sexualized violence against the more vulnerable members of a society, but that then Israel also projects itself as feminist and gay friendly. These are issues that all are part of our discussion of why Palestine is a feminist issue.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to, is it
Go
okay
ahead.
to do that?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to name in what everything that Neda just broke down. One of the comments that I also saw named that sexual violence or rape is not a feminist issue, is not a gendered issue. It's a matter of war. And I found that comment really interesting.
So it's a weapon of war. It's just simply a weapon of war. Just live with it.
Yeah, and I mean, besides the fact that that's like it's a very surface level, and to me personally, it's a very shallow comment that I don't think has a lot of analysis. But what I do think is interesting about it in this conversation is the lack of nuance that we usually experience in the Palestinian context, and in general, I think in context of oppression. I think that that's a strategy, is really oversimplifying things. For example, like war is a gendered issue. The violence that comes with war is very much a gendered violence. And so to try to categorize things in these really simplistic ways, I think is also just a running thread that I'm seeing and hearing in Hannah, Neda, and Mira, the things that you guys are talking about, is these kinds of tactics, like saying Palestine is a feminist issue somehow automatically means that we are saying Palestine is no other political issue, or that feminism is only one type of feminism and cannot be a multiplicity of things. And I think that that kind of oversimplification is something that really benefits Zionism and really benefits oppressors in general, is by reducing narratives to like this very static linear thing. And so for something as complex and nuanced as gendered violence, like if you try to reduce it to one sentence or one thing, I think that's the moment where you erase the experiences of a lot of vulnerable people. And you erase the really particular experiences that will inform your nuanced analysis or will inform what kind of politics you might hold. So I don't know, I guess that's just like a reverberating thing that I feel like everyone is kind of touching on too, is it's the both and, or it's the nuances, and it's the people who I think get invisibilized by mainstream narratives are the people who are representative of the really complicated ways that these structures work together, like Zionism, white supremacy, imperialism. And it's really important to interrogate those specific pockets, those margins, because that's where you also are able to understand more in depth materially how to respond to the oppression.
Thank you for that.
Can I add to
Mhm.
that too?
Go
So
ahead.
I was going to bring up the same comment, Yazan, that we got when we initially published the pledge that uh, rape is just a weapon of war and it's not gendered, because I thought that comment was in a dark way so like absurd to me. Like my conclusion, if we look at sexual violence in the context of war, is not to say that that means that it's not a gendered issue. In fact, that means that's a clear indication of why it is a gendered issue. Rather than saying that it's just a weapon of war, I would say that war is gendered. And I think, Yazan, to your point, which was so good, and I hadn't thought of it that way, like what narrative are we serving if we remove the gendered element? Like in that example, if we remove the gendered element, well, we're serving the larger narrative of Zionism also, that it's just a war and a conflict that Israel won, and so we should let it go. You know, like that narrative is also spoken to by that oversimplification. And so what do we serve by not addressing the gendered impacts of Zionism, settler colonial violence?
Yeah, but especially as well because Israel prides itself of how it is the most progressive and liberal and free country in the Middle East, surrounded by all these backwards people, and yet at the same time, the tactics used are very intentional, and the way violence is used against men versus women versus gender non-conforming is very deliberate and very specific. So I think that's why it is important that we address things in this particular way and shed a light on what does it mean and what does gender violence from Israel look like. So this takes me to another question that we received. And honestly, I feel like this is such a potentially the elephant in the room anytime we talk with our communities and use the term feminism. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings or confusion around this term, especially when it's coming from women, but just I think anybody that adopts that as a way to identify as a feminist, we see a lot of conflation with that being a Western notion. So I think it's very important that we actually take some time to unpack that and explain first maybe some of the tenets of the feminism that we adopt, but also kind of shed a light on how feminism is not necessarily just a Western thought that is foreign to us and our culture and traditions as we commonly hear. Who wants to take that one? Nada?
I guess I could. I mean, I think I touched on it already by saying that there's an understanding of feminism that is unfortunately extremely exclusionary, extremely narrow, extremely focused on what I call the glass ceiling feminism, and it's interesting because we do question the dominant discourse in projecting Zionism as a liberation rather than an oppressive system, and an ideology of oppression rather than liberation. We question that, but we don't necessarily question as much feminism as being that very, very narrow definition that the West has given us. It's like, this is the dominant discourse about feminism, that feminism is about breaking the glass ceiling. And there are so many different feminisms. And the very narrow exclusionary feminism that I would reject too, that is basically the one we hold up as the definition of feminism. We need to understand that feminism is so much more. We need to not claim, but actually reclaim feminism as a collective liberation, as a liberation of communities that would actually uplift everybody, every member of that community, rather than simply the women who have one barrier to their advancement, and that is the glass ceiling, equal pay. I mean, of course, who wouldn't want equal pay? But there is so much more to feminism than that glass ceiling. And so we need to actually understand, not broaden feminism. We don't need to do that. Feminism is already broad enough to encompass all of the aspects of oppression that are not necessarily understood when we say, I'm not a feminist, because this is not my idea of liberation. I mean, I do not want imperial feminism. We have had examples of imperial feminism where a country comes in and, like the prime example is, okay, the US has liberated Afghanistan, right? And now the women, I mean, that's one idea. It's like the saving brown women from brown men, saving Muslim women from Muslim men. This is not our idea of feminism. We do not want to be saved from the male members of our communities. This is not what, not that there isn't some gender-based violence within our own communities. I would not be in denial of that, but we don't want the kind of imperial feminism that only sees that sees the micro environment of gendered violence without looking at the macro environment, the macro versus the micro. And so, as I said, we're not in any way trying to broaden the meaning and the definition of feminism as much as we are actually claiming all of the other aspects of feminism, which are excluded from mainstream white feminism. It's only when we equate feminism with that very exclusionary, imperial, oppressive feminism that we say, I'm not a feminist. I don't want to be identified as a feminist. I reject feminism. What we are rejecting is the oppressive aspects of imperial feminism rather than feminism itself, because feminism is so much more than that.
I think too, if it's okay to add to that,
Yeah.
the points of collective liberation, like I think another oversimplification that I feel like has been emerging in response to the pledge or the general launch, and also typically I think feminists of color or leftists might get is why focusing on women, as if feminism is something that only applies to women, which I think here everyone has been touching on collective liberation. And there have been references to that Zionism is a gendered violence that impacts men, women, folks who identify as non-binary and trans. But I think that specific point for what Nada is talking about now, the feminist platform that is being developed by the PFC and is still in process, at the very least right now, like integral to it to me is acknowledging that Zionism and imperialism are gendered violences that produce harm and trauma for women, for men, for folks who identify as queer, trans, non-binary. And there's so many different ways that I think feminism is purposefully reduced to what Neda is talking about, which really is also very capitalistic, if we think of the glass ceiling, and also very, very human rights based. If a constitution or a bill of rights does things to change law and policy for women, that's a feminist move. And I think for those of us who also understand national struggle, we know that any type of liberation movement has to be more complicated than that. It can't be about integration into capitalism, and it can't be about just integration into law, because we don't have that luxury at all in the first place. And I think more importantly, because of the Oslo Accords and these other things, we've also seen that law and policy or the United Nations don't mean very much for us materially. Sometimes they result for Palestinians in necessities for survival, but they do not result in things that actually are definitive of liberation and of thriving. And so I think just for understanding feminism, it's also important to name that in our platform, there is a commitment to collective liberation that includes total liberation of Palestine and Palestinians. And I think that naming that also allows us to understand that there isn't an aspiration for some sort of liberal like rights. And that I think also pushes back then against some of the consolidations that we may sometimes hear around feminism, both from people within community and outside of community. To me, Palestine is not a humanitarian issue. Personally, humanitarianism is part of our problem, and part of why we're still continuing to experience so much violence is humanitarian frameworks that normalize war and imperialism and only offer band-aid solutions, for example. I know that's a little bit of a divergence, but I think it's just something that I've also been thinking about as Nada has been talking. But yeah.
Yeah, but Yazan, I also wanted you to say something about the weaponization of Western feminisms against our communities, against Palestinians, against people in our region as a whole. Again, you know, how it was employed in the whole war in Afghanistan, war on terror. I believe your work, your job also touches on that aspects of that as well. Tell us a little bit, some examples of how Western feminism is weaponized to then wage wars under the banner of liberating women. But then, I mean, honestly, I feel like I don't need to talk or explain how much damage it caused in worldwide and in communities. And you were beginning to touch on that issue of then, after destroying all of these countries, then coming in under the banner of humanitarian aid to kind of like keep feeding into the problems that were created in the first place because of imperialism. So talk a little bit about the weaponization of feminism in our countries. And as well, I think I want us to as well acknowledge the issue of pinkwashing, which Israel really just uses, especially in the context of criminalizing and demonizing the Palestinian people and making us look like we're the most homophobic people in the world. Just how the exploitation of all of these terms in Israel's global propaganda. And talk to us about that, please.
Sure. I was laughing because you used job in quotes, but I understand.
Daily job, other than your activism.
I understand. But yeah, I think with everything that Nada was talking about, because Nada also touched on Afghanistan and earlier was touching on queerness and the experience of queer Palestinians living under Zionist oppression. And I think that imperial feminism and pinkwashing have been used to justify either acts of violence, acts of war, or justify ongoing Zionist occupation. And so to me, this is really interesting. I think the most popular example that Nada already named is the invasion of the war, is the invasion of Afghanistan and the declaration of war. And I know a lot of people know about that example, but I think some things that are really important in the example of Afghanistan is there were red cell documents. So these were leaked later on, CIA red cell documents, where intelligence agents from the United States worked with France and Germany on developing talking points for the press, for the popular, like most consumed newspaper and online outlets in France and in Germany. And the talking points were how to get citizens of France and citizens of Germany to support the war in Afghanistan, because there were a lot of questions around how to get continued support from these countries for the war in Afghanistan, because there were the initial points of Iraq and Afghanistan where we don't want to go to war, we're not in an economic position. This is France in particular. And then also the political questions. There were, even though these are still Western countries that are very much involved in imperialism, there were a lot of like liberal concerns about going to war and the humanitarian impacts and not wanting to support war. And the talking points that the United States provided mapped out the German population tends to be more sympathetic to gender politics. Name that women in Afghanistan experience violence under men. Name that women in Afghanistan are experiencing violence under Islam and the Taliban. And so these kinds of things, if you see them mapped out, this of course comes out 10 years after the fact, what it shows you is it's a manipulation of popular opinion to garner support. And if this were actually the case, you wouldn't need talking points in this way, because obviously then what you see happening on the ground, for example, there's a woman who then, in response to the popular opinion, she went and documented the experiences of women and communities in Afghanistan who survived and are surviving US imperialism. And she found many examples of gender-based violence. She found examples of when the United States found a fuel line that it really wanted to appropriate, it bombed and razed a girls' school. Because at that time, that was in the way of the fuel and the profit, right? And so I think these kinds of examples really show that at the same time that the United States is pushing these talking points onto the press, in the exact same time span, it's also harming the communities and the infrastructures that it's claiming to support. And I know that this is already a very known narrative, but I think these really material examples are important because sometimes we reduce it to, oh, we said we went to war in Afghanistan to save women and we didn't. And it's more important to look at the material impacts. How much profit has the United States made from this? How many people have endured gender-based violence and poverty under this? I think those kinds of examples really matter for calling into question what type of feminism is the United States employing. This is very much a capitalist feminism. It's very much an imperialist feminism. It's very much an Islamophobic feminism. And this is not even getting into the United States' role in supporting the political militias that became the Taliban, right? And the Cold War. I know this is going down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I think these things matter because, again, I think it's the nuances of the history and the politics and the economics of it that allow for a simple sentence like, we need to go to Afghanistan to save women, to mean something that people support when there's all of this history here that gets overlooked. And I think for examples of pinkwashing in Palestine, there's a lot of credit that's given to the United States, that's given to Israel for being progressive on queer issues. There's a lot of really popular maps, I think, especially in the early 2000s, that would circulate where you could be stoned to death if you were queer. And then it would show like the US or Israel or Western Europe in colors that were different from places that were primarily East Africa, North Africa, and Swana. And I think those kinds of categorizations of our people in our countries serve to really reinforce this binary that the West is good for these things. Israel is trying to bring this progressivism to the region. But if you actually look at what kinds of policies the United States has, or the Zionist entity, Israel, most of the changes that have been instituted are structural, are in response to militarism and capitalism. And so I think a really invisibilized example, if you think of Israel, is originally the Zionist entity has been really known for intensive conservatism, and a lot of Orthodox Jewish people are actually, culturally, there's a creation of a lot of very conservative and homophobic social policies that exist. And there was a military research scientist who used to work for the Zionist entity who is gay. And when he was outed as gay, he was dismissed from his position, he was fired, and he lost his job and his livelihood. But then the IDF realized that the research that he was contributing, he's a nuclear physicist, was so important. They played an instrumental role in supporting legal changes that allowed for this man to live with his domestic partner. And they brought him back. And this is someone who has a long, I think 20-year plus career in the IDF before he became private intelligence. And so this actually is the legal changes in Israeli society that people now praised Israel for being progressive, but it actually came because of a military scientist, which is really interesting to think about. And similarly, when people say it's progressive in Israel, or there's a lot of support for women and for queer people, they're usually referencing that you can serve in the IDF as a gay person or as a woman. And similarly in the US, right, there's a lot of homo nationalism. You can be queer in the military. And let's be very specific. You can be lesbian, gay, bi, and a certain type of transgender. We're not talking about queer people who are still killed by the state. We're talking about people typically who either are white passing or have citizenship privilege or have a certain class stature and are willing to perform the right type of LGBTQ that either the US or Israel wants. And so if you look at that, or if you look at gay marriage as something else that's usually seen as an indicator of whether or not a country has progressed on its treatment of LGBTQ communities, what is marriage tied to? It's tied to law and economics. It's tied to the expansion of wealth. But in terms of getting resources to queer people who are enduring homelessness because they've been kicked out of their homes, if you're looking at the violence against sex workers, especially trans sex workers, these things don't exist anywhere, right? So thinking about what it actually means when a country is considered progressive or not is really important. And I think the last thing I really wanted to touch on is there's a lot of manipulation of the vulnerability of queer people in Palestine and Arab countries. So a really important example to think about is asylum cases in the United States. A lot of queer Arab that come here usually have to create or exaggerate, or at the very least divulge their experiences of homophobia and violence to be considered a valid or legitimate asylum case. And so whether or not their experience is actually as violent as they name isn't a question. I'm not questioning anyone's narrative, but there's a knowledge amongst queer people who migrate here that you have to say certain things and you have to condemn, for example, political militias. There have been cases where Hezbollah has been condemned by Lebanese migrants coming to the US who are queer as homophobic, Hezbollah being condemned as homophobic, sorry, to be clear. These kinds of things matter because you are putting pressure on an individual who's trying to come here to condemn their country, to condemn the politics of resistance, and to condemn the parties. And so I think these kinds of narratives matter. There's also examples of people who seek asylum who have to sign certain waivers formally condemning resistance, right? And so what does it mean? What does it mean if their safety and livelihood is dependent on them reinforcing another narrative? Again, this isn't questioning or commenting on the people who do this, right? The structures are forcing them and manipulating them to do it. But why? Why does the US want them to do this? What political agenda does it feed? And so obviously, if you hear and see all of this as someone who identifies as Arab or Palestinian, when you get these really surface, shallow, static definitions of feminism, and the legacy of feminism in your country means war, means the extraction of your nation's resources, means the imprisonment of your family members and torture, means that you do not have access to water and electricity, there is going to be a natural allergic reaction that might emerge amongst some communities. So when you have this accusation that Arab are homophobic, are backwards, are these different things, this is setting aside the actual interpersonal violence that community members face, but take into account the whole context. What kind of relationship to these narratives are communities going to have if it means so many charged traumatic violences? And this isn't to justify homophobia in communities. This isn't to justify gender-based violence, but to really think about if these are all of the ways and they're constantly being told this is feminism, this is LGBTQ rights, how does that not create a complicated relationship between certain community members and these ideas? That's work that we have to undo now and think about more in depth.
And
Anyway,
similarly
sorry, that was a lot.
yeah, I know it's fine though. It's I think it's a lot of important and valuable conversations. And similarly, I mean, in Palestine, the issue of nonprofits and civil society organizations being forced to sign documents that make them condemn basically resistance, different type of organization. Most organizations, if they're to receive American funding, but that definitely includes as well women's organizations. So we're not even allowed to organize in our own terms without having to make, you know, these political statements that satisfy the donor. We are about to run out of time. We wanted to close it out 11. But I wanted to open up to Nada and Hannah, if you have any further comments or anything you would like to add, whether in regards to our pledge or in regards to some of the feedback and questions that we saw coming, please do that so we can wrap up close to 11.
Okay. Yeah, so in relation to our pledge, I think building on this conversation that we're just having, I think what's really important to like assert about the work that we're trying to do is that these narratives that Yazan has named and the material and political conditions that they indicate are exactly what we're trying to undo. So in terms of like the depoliticized narratives of women's rights that suggest that the US or the West is somehow progressive and therefore justified in its imperialism, like those are exactly the narratives that we are trying to question and problematize, especially on the level of like both the depoliticization of women's or LGBTQ rights narratives and also the individualization of them. So when we're talking about feminism as collective liberation, it doesn't really matter if, if Israel posits itself as a queer haven for people, if ultimately that rests on the oppression of all Palestinians. So that rests on the oppression of LGBTQ Palestinians, women, and collective society. So it doesn't really matter if they embrace a certain individualized, depoliticized narrative of rights, if it requires these kinds of material violences that we've named. And so I just wanted to offer that that's part of what we're trying to undo, decoupling women's rights narratives and feminist narratives from their association with these larger violences, imperial, colonial, Zionist violences.
Nada, any final thoughts?
No, I'm actually humbled by the complex analysis that Hannah and Yazan have just offered. And I want to say, even this complex analysis barely touches the surface of all the work there is to do, all of the information, all of the knowledge, all of the activism, all of the organizing that we are engaged in and need to continue to engage in. So I think we basically presented an idea of the complexity of the issues that the Palestinian Feminist Collective is engaged in. I would actually encourage everyone, but I'm sure that that's what, Mira, what you wanted to say in conclusion, encourage everyone to actually not just read the surface level of our pledge, but think of the complexity of issues at every level in our very varied experiences, both in the Shatat and in the homeland, and read it, sign on, ask questions, send us feedback, and that's it. I mean, we are out of time, so I can't really add anything, but there's a complexity there that is actually encouraging and liberating if we start thinking of all these issues rather than the surface level of feminism. And is it feminist? Is it not feminist? And who's the oppressor? And it's at no level is there a binary. And that's what we want to be able to actually engage in.
Thank you. So at the closing of today's event, I wanted to thank you, Nada, Hannah, and Yazan, and our members that helped put today's event together. I also wanted to thank our allies who supported us so far, and our growing Facebook community and people who tuned in today. And I wanted to take a few moments to acknowledge essentially what Nada was saying, that what we covered today does not address all of the issues and struggles that we hope to work on. We are following with great concern the rising cases of violence and gender-based violence in our communities, in the homelands as well. Just to name a few, the very recent case of murder and rape of a little girl in Egypt this week, and the story of Firan al-Haddad in Hebron, who was murdered by her father. We are very disturbed by the cover-ups and the lack of justice on these issues of gender-based violence in our communities here and in the homelands. And we are again committed to not just working against Zionist repression and gender violence, but also the patriarchy and toxic masculinity that exists internally amongst us. And currently in the process, we are thinking of we are taking the time to think, to discuss, and envision how we could engage with all of these complex issues and hopefully have a meaningful contribution in educating and advocating for members of our communities impacted by all these forms of violence, in addition to standing up to Zionist forces, especially in women and feminist spaces. And with that, thanks to everyone again, and stay tuned for more events, for more educational panels, and maybe once back to normal real life activities. If you would like to get in touch, feel free to engage with us here on our Facebook page or email us at palestinianfeminists@gmail.com. Again, it's palestinianfeminists@gmail.com. And this email address also is available on our Facebook page if you look for it. Thank you so much again, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Right. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.